Thank you. So, good afternoon. This is my second talk here at RTU. It's a very great honor to be back here, and I'd like to thank Rector Vieslekija for the invitation to come here as a visiting professor. I'm here for a full week, giving a number of talks, but also visiting several of your research groups and administrative units, talking with professors and students to understand the current environment and hopefully make some recommendations about where RTU could develop new initiatives and help improve its position here in the Baltic region. So today I'll be covering a number of topics, part of which is going to include talking about coffee and soft drinks in cars. I'll explain what that means in a little bit and why that's related to innovation, entrepreneurship, and product design. I come from the Republic of California, which at the current time does belong to the United States, but we're very far away from Washington, D.C. And today I'll talk a little bit about what I do at Stanford. I lecture on European entrepreneurship and innovation in the engineering school. So just to be clear, I'm not in the business school. I'm from the School of Engineering. I'm in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Stanford. And I'll also be talking about current trends in Silicon Valley, some comments on the European innovation, entrepreneurship, product design scene. I'll be talking a lot about design thinking and product design, which is what we believe lies at the heart of great companies and new companies. A few comments on some of the strategic issues between Silicon Valley and Europe today, and then a few wrap-up thoughts. First of all, I'd like to, one of the key points I'd like you to take away here is this idea that success, research, starting great companies, we do not view this as a linear process. It's a very messy process. However, most of us are taught that success is all about this, is going up the career ladder, time after time, success after success, no failures, can't afford any failures. Well, each curve here is a failure. Each curve here may be a path which didn't make sense. This is what it really looks like to build a great company, to try and connect new ideas with the marketplace, and to build regions, new innovation regions, and to build great new institutions. So along with great failures go great successes, go great failures. And the acceptance of failure is part of what makes Silicon Valley work year after year. It's part of the culture. We value failure. It's one of the issues that Europe faces. One of the other things I'll talk about is the difference between design, art, and science. Here in Europe, here at technical universities across Europe, the primary mission is science. Which is an important goal, but I'll be talking a lot today about product design and design thinking, and the point of this chart here is actually to point out is that before science started, which was maybe around 5,000 years ago, design of tools, for example, design of vessels, started much, much longer before science. And what we're doing at Stanford Engineering School is trying to bring back design, not just design in the sense that's often understood here in Europe around arts and architecture, but design into engineering, design into building of companies, design of great products and services. We'll come back to that. First, a little bit about my background, and I'll try and run through this quickly just to give you a sense of what I do at Stanford. Each year I teach a course at Stanford focused on the European startup scene. This year, I've been doing this for 6 years. This year, all of the countries you see in colored, where you see pictures, this is where we had speakers from Poland, from France, from the UK, Belgium, Denmark, Croatia, Slovenia, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey, for example. And what I do is I talk about entry strategies into Europe for Silicon Valley startups. How do you enter the European marketplace? How do you bring Silicon Valley type products and services to European consumers and enterprises? And here you see last year we had Peter Westerbacke of Angry Birds speak along with the two co-founders of Prezi out of Budapest, Hungary. Peter Arbai and Peter Halachi. This was our panel of Silicon Valley companies talking about their European entry strategies. So Yelp, Facebook, Flipboard, and Indiegogo. Indiegogo is one of the emerging crowdfunding companies you may be hearing about. We also talk about accelerators and boot camps across Europe. Last year we also featured Garage 48, which has become a very famous and well-known Estonian export. And this year we also talked about streaming and user experience design companies out of Hungary and Poland, featuring Gyula Feher from Ustream. So let me come to that in a minute. Estonian Business Angel Network. Our sponsors, our partners this year were the Flanders region in Belgium, Enterprise Estonia, and DLA Piper. DLA Piper is one of the Valley's leading law firms. So our last speakers, this was just 2 weeks ago, March 10, very interesting startups out of Gdansk and Budapest, featuring Ustream. Ustream is one of the leading streaming companies globally. Co-founder out of Budapest. UXPin is a very interesting user interface design company based in Gdansk in Silicon Valley. So this is the lecture hall. This is the Hewlett Lecture Hall, named after Bill Hewlett, as in Hewlett and Packard. His foundation provided funding for much of our engineering school. So Hungary and Poland, Flanders and Sweden. Sweden has strong ties here. Some of you may have heard of Creandum, which is Sweden's top venture capital firm. So this is Martin Hauge and our Flanders partners here. Those of you who are thinking of doing startups at some point might want to talk to Creandum, based in Stockholm. We also featured Index Ventures out of Switzerland. So Index is probably the top venture capital firm in Europe today, based in London and Switzerland. Product design firm out of Turkey, so Istanbul and Geneva, London and Croatia. Equity crowdfunding, so Cows in the Cloud company, very interesting startup funded by Seedcamp out of London. Denmark, Austria, Martin and Mikael. So Zendesk, Mikael's company Zendesk is very interesting enterprise software, essentially providing online customer support to companies around the world. They moved it to San Francisco several years ago. Vasil, our first entrepreneur founder out of Sofia, amazing company. Telerik just established operations in Silicon Valley last spring. So now Sofia, Bulgaria has a spot right down in the heart of Silicon Valley on University Avenue. Yapec Jakopin out of Slovenia, very interesting yacht design, wind energy design company. So Bulgaria and Slovenia. Enterprise Estonia, our partner, we've already talked about them. Project A Ventures, one of the leading new accelerators venture funds in Berlin, a spin-out from Oliver Samber and the Samber Brothers Rocket Internet. So Estonian Business Angels, Project A Ventures. And then at the beginning of the session, a Russian VC, Almost Capital, Sasha Glitsky, and the family out of Paris, one of France's new accelerators for French startups. And we invite you, so we put all our lectures online now, full videos, audio, as well as PowerPoint slides. These are all available to you at no cost. It's part of what Stanford's doing now in online education. This is our YouTube channel, and our PowerPoint slide archive. You're welcome to download and look at these at any time. Outside of Stanford, I work with European, US, other international companies, advising them on questions of innovation and entrepreneurship and design. Also, I've worked with a number of European and Latin American universities, either as a visiting professor or as an advisor to rectors and deans. Some of my other work in Europe has included advising the Prime Minister of Ireland on their new innovation strategy back in 2010. And then also from time to time working in Brussels, advising the European Commission or the European Parliament on issues of innovation, and mentoring and coaching startups across Europe too as well. So that's a little bit of background about me. That's important because most Americans you might meet don't spend as much time as I do in Europe, working deep in Europe. So I come here with a little bit deeper perspective and understanding of European institutions and the European situation. A little bit of an overview about current trends in Silicon Valley and at Stanford University. So this is very important to understand exactly what we do and what we don't do in Silicon Valley. So what we do is we focus on highly scalable companies that we can grow quickly, that we can scale up in terms of value to valuations of billions of dollars very quickly, that we scale up, that have scalable technical architectures, that have scalable equity structures as well, that we can build innovation-centric cultures around, and that are very focused on rapid execution and growth. And we build those companies to sell them. The idea is to build them in a few years, sell them, and then go on to build another company. That's serial entrepreneurship. In Europe, you have a bit of that. It's improving, it's getting better. Skype, Spotify, SoundCloud, Rovio, numerous other examples in the UK, other countries. But the European economy is still very dominated by the millions and millions of SMEs, small, medium enterprises, along with family-based entrepreneurship, German Mittelstand, in Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and France. Some very excellent manufacturing companies. Eastern Europe, what has been called black entrepreneurship, so black markets, so under-the-counter companies. Very export-oriented, but for the most part, new companies in Europe today are built for a single, built for one time. They're built not to sell, they're built to keep in the family. Because the assumption is it's going to be so difficult for you to build your company that you're not going to have another time, there won't be time in your life to build another one. And you might not be able to sell the first one you build anyway. So build to sell, build not to sell, build to keep in the family. This is what we do. This is all we do here in Silicon Valley, focusing on highly scalable, rapid growth companies in many different sectors, primarily IT, but also in energy and other sectors. Just to give you some examples of high growth companies. So companies that have shown this kind of growth, so these are users in the tens of millions. So this is 20 million, 40 million, 140 million. Just some examples of what we call hockey sticks. So hockey stick is basically when you go exponential, when you get viral consumer growth. These are all consumer companies. And we see these over and over again. Google Plus really exploded in less than 3 months, up to over 150,000 users. Sorry, 50 million users. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. More recently, Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. Again, these are in the 100 million, 150 million, 200 million, going from May 2007 up to May 2011, so in the space of 2 or 3 years. And then most recently, you may have heard of WhatsApp, which was recently acquired by Facebook just a month or so ago for a valuation of about $19 billion. So here you have going from year 0 to year 4 to over 400 million users. Can anyone tell me how many employees WhatsApp has? Yes? You, sir? Anyone in that area? Yes?
Under 50?
You had an answer. 35. People built a company worth $19 billion. And some people in Silicon Valley think that they sold it too cheaply. Perhaps with some justification. So these are hockey sticks. This is what we do. For every one of these great successes, there are dozens and hundreds of failures, companies that never reach that. You never hear about those. You only hear about these guys. So where's Silicon Valley today? So this is the percentage of venture capital going in basically from over 2012 and 2013 across the major tech regions in the US. Silicon Valley, New England, New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. So you see Silicon Valley kind of about the same. New England is declining in terms of relative share. And guess what? New York popped up last year up to 15%. So New York City is overtaking Boston at this point in time as a major tech cluster in the US. Very, very, very interesting. Los Angeles also declining relative. DC coming up a little bit. And you can see that the portion of venture capital that is going to Silicon Valley is a little bit over 40% of the entire United States. And it's been going up. And so here's the crisis, like 2008. You can see it's continuing to go strong and is even attracting more venture capital these days. Quick comparison of the North American, so this includes Canada and European venture capital scenes. So the North American, so basically the American market for venture capital is about 29 billion. If you include in Canada, it's 32.5. Europe is a little under 5 billion. So you can see the United States still dominates this, and that Europe's a relatively small portion. This is the rest of the world. And so here you have billions of dollars invested. Here's numbers of deals. So Europe is currently accounting for about a quarter of the deals being done compared to the US and Canada at this point. In terms of the different geographies, so here you have the UK, Germany, France. The black dots represent the number of deals here. The red represent the total deal amount invested. You can see that the UK is accounting for most of the deals being done, and also for most of the venture capital going in as well, with Germany a distant second, and even further behind France, Sweden, everywhere else. And the gap actually is increasing between the UK and the rest of Europe. So, what do we do at Stanford? I come out of the engineering school. The engineering school is the heart of entrepreneurship at Stanford. It's not the business school. All the great companies you've heard of coming out of Stanford over the years, starting with Hewlett-Packard, Cisco, Google, Yahoo, VMware, many others, they're either out of electrical engineering or computer science. They're not started by business students. They're started by either undergraduate students or master's students or PhD students. However, the business school and medical school also have very important, significant entrepreneurship centers involving both students and faculty. So there are several student clubs. This is the main student club in the engineering school, the BASES. The MBA students in the business school have their own club, which is very active, and the postdocs. So these are the students who finished their PhDs and who are now doing postdocs, mostly in medicine, but also in engineering. They have their own entrepreneurship club as well. Each of these clubs organize courses. They do events. They bring in investors, VCs, angels, coaches and mentors, attorneys to work with students to help form companies. We've also, 2.5 years ago, started a new accelerator. This was started by students, so it was a student idea. They spun it out. They received approval from the university, and now it's doing extremely well. I'll show you some numbers in a few minutes. So Stanford Student Enterprises is essentially the equivalent of student union here at RTU. And so the students, this is a very broad-based movement at Stanford, whereas in most European universities, 1% or less of students are actively engaged around entrepreneurship. At Stanford, it's between 7 to 10% of students. And a lot of the companies that come out and they get formed in Silicon Valley come from Stanford University. Let me give you some concrete numbers. So in the last 2.5 years, this is StartX, again, our student accelerator. About 1,200 companies have applied to join the accelerator formed by current or former students. About 10% have been accepted. The important number here is that Stanford, which is about the same size as RTU in terms of students, we're about 15,500 students. You're at about 15,000, now right? We're forming today a little under 500 companies a year. Let me repeat that. Students and alumni, faculty, but mostly students today are forming a little under 500 companies a year at Stanford. We're the same size as RTU. And we're smaller than many public universities in Europe. So this is actually good news because This means that universities of this same size, such as RTU, if they have the right conditions in place, which can take time to put in place, but given the right conditions and the right study, the right research areas, the right culture, this is a number which RTU and other public universities of this same size can shoot for, not in the near term or medium term, but it's a very possible number in the long term. So this is vastly over anything you see out of other European universities, and even way ahead of MIT, which is also very strong around entrepreneurship. Now, another important number is, so who is actually forming those companies? Guess what? It's only 10% of professors that are forming these 480 companies a year. Most of the companies, 90%, are started by undergraduates, and the rest by master's and PhD students. So the master's and undergrad students, about 40%, they're not creating their companies out of research laboratories. They start their companies with students they meet in the residences, the student residences. They start their companies based on people they meet in courses. We have courses specifically designed to help students start companies. They generally don't start companies out of the research laboratories. They might meet some of their founders in the Mensa, in the cafeteria. 50% are formed primarily out of research, where intellectual property is developed. So there's a big assumption today in Europe that most startups, most spin-outs from universities will come from the research laboratories. Our experience is that only around half come out of the research laboratories. So that's good news for undergraduates and master's students as well, particularly those who are interested in IT and software, where it's relatively easy to start new companies. There's no reason why undergraduates and masters can't start companies as well as PhD students and professors. That's also one of the lessons to take away from the Stanford experience. The role of student residences at U.S. universities is very important. They're essentially informal incubators. Facebook was started at Harvard inside this dormitory. That's where Mark Zuckerberg used to live, in that student residence. And at Stanford today, so this is the Stanford campus, these are the athletic facilities, this is the main campus with classroom and research facilities, this is the medical school. All of this land here is student residence areas, graduate and undergraduate. And so think of all of this as incubators of companies. So this is one of the reasons why Stanford creates such large numbers of companies, and why many U.S. universities which have strong residence systems are becoming increasingly engaged and successful in student company creation. So point here is that university residences can be important incubators for new companies as well. So just to sum up Stanford in terms of where we are, we spend a little over $4 billion a year. We bring in revenue from federal government, from endowment, from student fees. It's a significant amount. Harvard, MIT, the other big American universities are about this level. And as you can see again, we're around 15.5 with a little under 2,000 professors and 7 schools or faculties. So are there any questions before I go into your section? And by the way, this is not a lecture here. We're here to have a discussion and dialogue. So I would like very much, feel free to interrupt with any questions at any time. Yes, sir. Can we get a microphone? Oh, yes.
I understand it's a highly competitive environment at Stanford, both for students and the faculty. So how do you handle stress?
Did everyone hear that? Could you repeat it, please?
How do you handle stress at Stanford University, being such a competitive environment?
Great question. One of the ways we handle stress is sports, athletic facilities. This is our dedicated sports complex with football teams, baseball teams, swimming. We have 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's not the only way the Bay Area has great weather. You can go bicycling, golfing. Even though Stanford's and Silicon Valley are very competitive, there's a strong emphasis on outdoor activity, outdoor sports. More and more people are also moving slowly towards meditation, other types of alternative stress reduction activities. It is an ongoing concern broadly in the U.S. The U.S. lifestyle can be very stressful depending on where you live. So in a high-paced, fast-paced environment like this, stress management is very important. And that's something that Stanford offers student services around mental health, stress reduction. Part of what you learn at Stanford is how to manage your entire life when you're having a very full life of professional academic activities, personal activities, and sports. More questions? You sure? Okay. Did you have a question? No. All right.
Hold on.
Oh.
I have it.
Yes.
I have a question.
So the question is the idea about the hockey sticks that you showed a couple of slides ago. For example, the MySpace. It's been known for already some years that this curve, it stops at some point. And do you care, there at Stanford, do you study, do you research why this curve stops, why the number of people stops growing, for example, for MySpace or for Google Plus or something like that?
We do to a certain extent, and actually there's a lot of analysis done by people in the Valley, independent bloggers, media, entrepreneurs who are constantly analyzing why companies grow and why some fail. The basic reason that MySpace stopped growing was because Facebook had a better platform. MySpace really was, after it reached a certain point, was not scalable in terms of attracting people. It lost its viral connection into the consumer base that Facebook had. Facebook kept going viral, so users recruiting other users to join, whereas MySpace, its original concept, which was designed more around bands and small groups, it didn't have the right design, which allowed it to basically continue making inroads into consumers based on viral feedback from user to user.
So this means that regardless that there are those examples of hockey sticks, it's still possible to fail, even amongst the winners. If you take MySpace as example of hockey stick case where it's a success, and then again it stops, and so it is a failure.
So let's talk about ICQ. So ICQ used to be the leading online chat service back in the early 2000s. Well, they're gone, basically. So yes, companies fail all the time, even if they can show early hockey stick style growth, but that doesn't mean that their management team really knows how to keep them there and continue growing. So it's not a guarantee of success. Each phase you go through, each growth phase you go through as a company brings different challenges to CEOs. A lot of management teams don't make the transition, or they have to bring in different CEOs to basically take the company to the next step. So let's go on to Europe and some of my observations from having worked in Europe for over 6 years. And we're going to come back to coffee cups and soft drinks in a couple of minutes. So we've talked about lessons from Silicon Valley. We're also going to talk about lessons for Latvia, which Finland, which Ireland, Germany, but also Italy, UK, Belgium, Bulgaria, and Switzerland have different lessons on different topics. First of all, however, we're going to talk about Mercedes-Benzes and cup holders. Okay, who drives a Mercedes-Benz here, other than the rector? Officially. Who would like to drive a Mercedes-Benz? Okay, this half, yes, over here. So this is the Benz half, the non-Benz half. Would all non-Benz people please move to this side? So there's a famous story at Stanford that when we began working with Mercedes back in the late 1990s, that's when they first entered the Valley, German engineers at Daimler were really horrified to learn that they had, that American consumers, drivers wanted to drive with coffee or soft drinks, and were asking for this new strange thing which would completely ruin the beautiful interior of a Daimler called a cup holder. So, I mean, there was huge resistance on the part of German engineers who just loved their perfect interior to putting cup holders in there. And so here you have, I'm just going to run through a few examples of cup holders, current cup holders, some of the early ones in a current form. Down here, very elegant Benz. I'm not sure which model this is, but I wouldn't mind driving this. But here's the offending item, okay? It's what the drivers want, what consumers want, but it's aesthetically, how can you do this to our beautiful interior, right? It's a soda can, it's a Coke. I mean, it's crazy. Why would those crazy Americans do this? It's so un-German. It ruins the aesthetic beauty of our perfect car. Well, so these were some of the early cup holders that the engineers at Daimler designed. And you have to admit, these are pretty unattractive looking cup holders. But you have to carry your coffee with you somewhere. Now keep in mind that many people in the United States drive 30 minutes to an hour to get work. So this may not seem like a big deal, but it's actually quite important. They get their coffee, they take it in the car. It's an important way to wake up on the way to work. And other generations of cup holders looked like this, pretty ugly things. But then, after some time, the German engineers at Daimler became accustomed. They thought they understood why this was important. So now you're seeing many different designs for cup holders in German Mercedes, which are actually quite attractive and clever. I'm just going to run through a few examples. This is from 2012. This is kind of a little leather cup. Not as fancy maybe as this hideaway thing. And then you have, I love this one, the net. Okay, it's like you're playing basketball inside the car with this hoop on your front dashboard. This is a really cool one. So this is here you have an entire unit now as a cup holder which slides in and out, so it hides the cup holder. So now we're getting really technically complex. It's almost like a DVD drive, but it looks very good inside the dashboard of a Benz. And here's the latest model. So now actually, of course, they're getting really high tech. The cup holders in the high-end Benzes are heated, okay? So they have this little red glowing light that keeps your coffee warm while you're driving. Very, very fancy. One more reason to buy a fancy Mercedes. But the lesson here is that sometimes you have to trade off engineering perfection versus listening to the voice of the customer. And this is one of the important points I think many engineers, both in Europe, Asia, and the US miss, is we get so obsessed with the technical beauty of our design, of our gadget, of our software, that we don't understand why people don't want to use it. It's so gorgeous. You know, can't you just see the beauty and the architecture? Sales and marketing is where it's at. You have to go out and sell these products. You have to convince users to use these. And so one of the things that's become very important in recent years to attract people to use new products is designing them in a way which is easy for people to use. This is where I'll come and talk about product design and design thinking in a few minutes. And this is one of the differences between MIT and Stanford. Stanford is known for being much more focused on the sales and marketing side, focused on the user interface, on the voice of the customer, whereas MIT tends to be very engineering-driven, focusing on the beauty of the technical gadget, device, and assuming that it's going to sell itself somehow in the marketplace. So that's one lesson from Germany. There will be other ones. Here's a lesson from Finland. So here you have, not too far from here in Helsinki, at Aalto University, the Aalto Entrepreneurship Society. And the lesson I'd like you to take away from this and some of these other examples I'll show you is that you don't need to go to Silicon Valley to find great examples of innovation. There's a lot of it happening in Europe, very close to your borders, right here. Finland, there is a lot of very good stuff going on in Finland, driven not just by companies, not just by government, by university presence, but being driven by students. The students in Finland at Aalto University in Helsinki have been a major driver pushing Finland, pushing their university towards entrepreneurship through the Aalto Entrepreneurship Club. Student clubs have a very important role to play in building entrepreneurship culture inside universities, in organizing events, in helping students connect with other students, connect with investors, mentors, and coaches around the university. Student clubs help accelerate the rate, increase the number of companies that are being formed, but also they can provide support services, supportive environment in a way that can be difficult for professors to provide. So I recommend everybody here who's considering doing a startup or wants to see some of the best action in innovation and entrepreneurship and design in Europe, go to Helsinki. There's a lot of great stuff going on. And if you can, go in November to the Slush Conference. It's the top entrepreneurship conference in Europe today. So that's a lesson from Finland. Here's a lesson from the UK. Who here is a hardware engineer? So electrical or mechanical engineer? Okay, great, there's a few of us. So Raspberry Pi is an open source board, hardware board with chip and interfaces, which came out of Cambridge University, UK. Over the past 4 years, they've built and sold over 2 million units. Initially, it was aimed at UK schools. So the idea was to give schools a very easy to program board where students could plug in sensors, build toys, build experiments. For example, now companies are using it. We use Raspberry Pi boards at Stanford. Cambridge, UK, it's a foundation, so it's not even a for-profit organization, but a great example of world-class innovation which has scaled up and gone outside Europe, out of Cambridge. Out of Italy, you have another open source hardware architecture platform called Arduino. It's a different chip, different standard, but also has gained very widespread adoption around the world. We use Arduino boards lots at Stanford in our teaching programs for students in robotics, used very widely in Silicon Valley by startup companies who want to build prototypes very, very quickly and very, very cheaply. Also, so who's a software person here? Informatics, programmers, okay, great. Drupal, anyone heard of Drupal here? Drupal is a major software platform, open source platform, developed in Belgium, which is being used by thousands of companies and nonprofits around the world to manage their websites and large databases. Founded by Dries Bouyatert, it's based in Belgium and Flanders. Great example of European innovation, which is scaled up globally. We use Drupal at Stanford. We buy Drupal. It's enterprise software. It's vital to running Stanford's enterprise software systems, as well as the IT systems of many Silicon Valley companies. So again, this is Belgium. The difference here is that in the US, we have many, many early adopters. So consumers and enterprises that are willing to buy and use these new technologies as soon as they come out the door. So coming back to Germany, a positive example from Germany, I sit on the advisory council of the German Silicon Valley Accelerator. It's the official bridge between Germany and Silicon Valley. We bring German startups every 3 months, a new group of startups. And this is one model of a very successful bridge supported by a European government, the German government, but which is run by German universities and private investors to train, coach, and mentor German startups out of Berlin, Munich, Karlsruhe, Hamburg, other cities. And Estonia is doing this on a regular basis. Lithuania is beginning to bring over their startups. The Turks, the Russians. We're seeing groups from the Finns. We're seeing groups of startups, student-run startups, student-founded startups coming from many parts of Europe on a regular basis. This is just one model. And now one example not to follow is Bulgaria. Now, Bulgaria, we're seeing some very interesting companies coming out of Bulgaria. But when I was in Bulgaria last year, I discovered that there were 38 Groupon clones formed in Bulgaria. Now, I'm not an opponent of clones, but 38's a bit much. You know, it shows that Bulgarians were not talking to other Bulgarians. It was easier for them to come up with a copycat idea than come up with their own idea. So maybe 3 or 5 might have been reasonable, but these are 30 teams of wasted effort, which they learned a lot, but really ended up going nowhere because no one would ever buy them. So the lesson from Bulgaria is, if you're isolated as a country, if your network, if you don't have these big global networks, if you don't know what's going on outside your country, you're going to end up with 38 Groupons. So the lesson here is, get out of Latvia, see what's going on, find out who's doing what, read TechCrunch, Arctic Startup, the other press, go to Helsinki, Berlin, London, and just build out your networks. And who has a Twitter account here? Great, so that's maybe about a third of you. Everyone here should consider getting a Twitter account of their own, if not for tweeting what you're doing, so you can hook into the Twitter feeds of major startups, investor groups across Europe and USA to find out what's going on. Twitter is a great source of information about what's happening now, very real. So now I'm going to go into product design. Before, are there any questions about Europe? There's a lot more I can say about Europe, but we have only limited time here. Okay. So, the reason that Apple and Google have in the past 5 years undermined, basically taking huge market share away from Nokia and Ericsson is because of a combination of great product design together with really important innovations in the business model. So this section of my talk, I'm going to focus on product design and the importance of product design, using some very concrete examples. And the point here that I'm going to be making here is that a lot of entrepreneurship education, teaching of entrepreneurship in Europe and in the US, focuses first and foremost, at universities, focuses first and foremost on the business plan. Okay, you end up writing long documents. Here's our business plan, it's a 75-page document. No one in Silicon Valley reads business plans anymore. It's a waste of time. You're changing your company concept, your product concept so frequently that to rewrite the business plan, it's just not useful. So the most you're ever going to be asked for today in the Valley is a PowerPoint pitch deck, which you may have to modify 3, 4, 5 times, maybe more, but no one's ever going to ask you for a business plan. Okay, that's really it's a 1990s concept today in the Valley. So that's one thing. And a lot of entrepreneurship education focuses far too much on business plan preparation and development. What entrepreneurship education does not focus on today in most places around the world is the product. Okay, if you don't get your product right, if you don't get the product design right, if you haven't tested it in the marketplace with real users, you don't really have a company. It all starts with the product and the product market fit. At Stanford Engineering School in mechanical engineering, we have an entire group at school focused just on product design, which I'll be talking about today. We have many courses aimed at our graduate and undergraduate students. One of them is called ME310. Students work with companies during the course of a year to develop new product ideas in the area of medical devices, for example, working with companies, established companies who basically give students an idea. They run with it for 9 months. They do market research. They build many prototypes, and at the end of the year, they present the companies with their idea of what this best new product should look like. We do this with aviation companies, aerospace companies, automotive companies, many of them European, many of them Asian. So again, this is in mechanical engineering. The design school, so I encourage you to visit our website, dschool.stanford.edu, where all we do is teach and talk about product design and design thinking in its many forms. And this is very radical innovation for engineering schools. Actually, it's a joint project with other parts of the university, with the business school, with humanities and sciences, with psychology, with arts. Product design, design thinking is a way to bring together different disciplines: engineering, business, medicine, humanities, anthropology, sociology, in very, very fluid ways to conceptualize from new, to rethink what products are for and what needs they're trying to meet. So we believe that putting the product concept at the start of entrepreneurship education is a much better way to build great companies instead of just starting with the business plan and PowerPoint slides is the main thing you teach students. So, and based on my work in Europe, Latin America, this notion of putting the product at the center of the company concept is simply not being done in most countries or universities today. In fact, there's a lot of resistance in engineering schools around the world to this product design thing because it doesn't have enough equations, it's too qualitative, it doesn't have enough quantitative activity in it, quantitative thinking, it's too applied. Well, part of our mission at Stanford is to teach students how to really build real things and not just write fancy equations on the board. We believe in giving students very practical education as well. So when you start with the product as the core concept, what you're trying to get to is what we call product market fit. You're trying to get to the point where you have a product idea, you've tested it in multiple application areas, you've tested it with real users, with real consumers or enterprises, and before you scale up the company, before you start hiring people, lots of people, before you start building huge technical architectures, you want to test your product idea, your service idea as quickly as possible and spend as little money as possible. And this is where design thinking comes in. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So product market fit, it's really a process of search, of iteration. So this product concept didn't work. Well, maybe we should try adding this or subtracting that, maybe changing the market focus a little bit. So we'll go this direction, go that direction. It's a constant search process in those early days. And before you really start, asking for investment, before you start hiring lots of people, before you start dedicating a lot of time to really putting in the engineering, you really need to understand whether this particular product service concept has traction in the marketplace, is attracting users. So we call this the early phase. It's really market exploration, where you're still exploring what the market is. You're then investigating the market, and eventually, once you've identified that this product concept really is getting interest and positive feedback from users, that's when you get into the market exploitation phase. That's when you start to raise venture capital. That's when you start to build your engineering prototypes. And the point here is you want to be working with the very early adopters, which we call the innovators, so the 2.5%. The people who are willing to try, the very first people who are willing to try new products and services. If you don't get their attention, if you don't get good feedback from them, then you need to try something different. So product market fit is all about searching for customer validation. It's about discovering who the customers are. If the customers, your users, don't validate what this thing is that you're trying out, you change your concept, or what we call pivot. Pivot is this, you change direction. Once you get to the point where you do have customer validation, then you start to build your customer base, customer creation, and then only then are you in a position to start building the company. So this is one of the points that's missed in entrepreneurship education in many universities around the world, including in the United States, who focus too much on just rushing to the company building phase based on PowerPoint slide deck without really building prototypes, testing them with real users. So design thinking is a creative process which fosters innovation and helps building of ideas. And I'm going to walk you through briefly exactly what this process is. Basically, there are 6 different steps where you understand the problem, you observe the problem space. You know, what is the challenge you're trying to fix? This is where you go out and watch potential users and customers. You understand exactly what problem is you're trying to solve. Then you think of different solutions, different products and services you could offer to fix this problem, to address this challenge. You prototype your product and service, and then you test it. And it's this prototyping and testing that we'll be spending a bit more time on today. And so we have the problem space up front and the solution space. And keep in mind that, again, there's very, very few equations in here. This is not quantitative. It's very qualitative. It's about testing ideas before you start building hard engineering prototypes and doing the real engineering. It's about creating choices, so exploring. So what about this idea over here? What about this idea over here? What if we, instead of making this device blue, we make it red, we'd add an extra button here. What if we design the user interface this way instead of that way, which makes it easier for users to adopt or move to the next page. This is a very different type of approach to product development that is taught in typical engineering schools. Engineering schools traditionally do not focus on product development. They teach engineering design, not product design. 2 very different things. Engineering design is about modeling, it's about equations, it's not about designing products. So again, you have these 5 phases: research, analyze. We'll focus on the prototype and test phase. This is the understand and observe phase, where you actually send teams. You go out as your team into the marketplace. You maybe take pictures of how people are actually behaving in supermarkets. So if you want to design a new shopping cart, for example, you might go into supermarkets and just watch how people use existing shopping carts. Take pictures of them. So when I come here, I'm taking pictures all the time because it helps me understand and observe how people in the hallways in the research laboratories interact with the space around them. And so this is where you're basically trying to understand the social environment in which people behave and use services or could use a new service. You then ideate. This is where you just throw out lots of ideas, see which ones stick, which ones are crazy. The crazy ones sometimes end up being the more interesting ones. This process allows you to question fundamentally what is the problem we're trying to solve. It also allows you're much more likely to come up with disruptive product ideas using design thinking, this type of approach, than traditional approaches to product design. One of Europe's difficulties is that Europe is very good at incremental design, incremental innovation. Europe is not very good at disruptive innovation for a number of reasons, and it's in part because of the lack of approaches to product and service concepts. Prototyping. So in typical engineering schools, there's a lot of focus on prototyping, using 3D manufacturing, detailed models. That's important and good, but this is a different type of prototyping that we're talking about. So this is how typical prototypes that you think about in engineering schools. The type of prototyping we do in design thinking at Stanford uses very basic materials, such as wood, clips, paper, scissors, plastic board, glue. The advantage of using these types of materials is that you can build your prototypes very quickly, in a couple of hours, and if they don't work, you throw them out. Start over again. You can build dozens of these types of prototypes. You can take them out into the marketplace, put them in users' hands. How does this feel? Would you add an extra button here? Would you change the display? So this is even before you get to engineering prototyping. So for example, one of the products that one of our student teams developed, they wanted to come up with a new medical device for use in surgery that would allow surgeons to extract bone marrow more easily. So this was the idea they had. This is what they ended up with at the end of the prototyping process. But what did they start with? That was the engineering prototype. That was the first prototype they came up with. Not very fancy, didn't require equations, but it was enough to take to surgeons at Stanford Hospital and other hospitals, explain the concept to them, say, would you use this? What features would you add to this? Well, would you actually hold it like this, or would you be more likely to hold it like this? For example, you can start getting users to actually play with this and think through the process of how they would use it in a real operating environment. And they haven't even built a real engineering prototype yet. So this costs, €2 to build, okay? And you can build 20 of them, take them out to 20 surgeons. Again, if it doesn't work, you throw it away. No big deal. So the design thinking approach, you go through this use of many different prototypes where you basically build the prototypes you expect to use, build some prototypes you call dark horse prototypes. Dark horse prototypes are the kind of crazy designs which we think no one would really seriously consider, but it gives you an alternative to think about, to bound the space you're in. And then once you've actually gotten some user feedback, then you start to converge on much more detailed prototypes, which can end in traditional engineering prototypes, which is what you typically build here at RTU. So, and eventually, the point of building prototypes is so that you can test them, take them out for users to actually play with. So, at Stanford, we have a class taught by a colleague of mine called Steve Blank. And the students, the point of the class is to teach students, help them build a real company in 10 weeks. Each week, students are required, the team, to talk to minimum 10 to 15 customers. So we have lectures, we give them lectures, but most of the classroom experience is when the teams come back and present to the rest of the class what they learned from the 10 to 15 customers they talked with in the past week. So our students spend actually very little time in the classroom. It's all about getting out on the street. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of dedication, but this approach, talking directly to users, has actually proven most successful in reducing failures and increasing success rates of companies. I have recommended to the European Commission that they adopt this approach in all Horizon 2020 projects. If Stanford students can speak to 100 customers, users in 10 weeks, why can't Horizon 2020 teams talk to 1,000 users in 3 years? I don't have an answer from the European Commission on that one yet. It's a radical idea in commission terms, but we're doing this not just at Stanford, but at Berkeley, Columbia. This approach of teaching entrepreneurship is going across the United States right now as we speak. It was pioneered at Stanford. And so, for example, students will come back. So this is an example of a presentation the students came back with on 1 week. This is what they found. So they went into hospitals and they actually looked at how patients are handled inside hospitals. So these are some of the presentations. So they actually went in and mapped the interactions within a hospital environment. So this is what we mean by building companies. And you don't see any calculus or differential calculus equations in here, partial differentials. This is the qualitative side of building companies. Now, eventually at some point you do get to the hardware prototypes. Absolutely. But the point of this approach is to delay the real engineering as long as possible, because as soon as you get to this phase, the costs go up, you slow down, you're much less willing to throw these away because the users didn't like them, compared to building plastic and paper prototypes. Excuse me. So just to give you some examples of some success stories, one of our projects, we were asked to help poor communities in Africa, basically with water. So water supply is a very big problem in many African villages. It's very heavy to carry water over several kilometers. Typically women in Africa have carried this on top of their heads, which means it's bad for their health, but it also limits the amount of water they can carry. So by rethinking this problem, our students came up with what's called the Hippo water roller, which is a completely different way, simple way of helping families get access to water in much larger volumes while preserving the health and well-being of the women of the families. This is currently being used in Africa today. And I won't talk about the business model canvas, but eventually you have to link the product market back to the business model canvas. We talk about making things, so we make things. This is the engineering school at Stanford. Whereas there's a lot of emphasis around entrepreneurship in other parts of the US and in Europe around building companies to make money. We build companies because we want to change the world, because we love making things. And so this is a fundamental, different approach to building companies and thinking about what you want to do with your life. You want to focus on making things, creating something new, creating something innovative, or is your real goal just to make money? At Stanford Engineering, we focus on making things, not the money. And one of the good news is, so I talked about Ireland. In Ireland, just in the last 3 years, they have adopted at 2 Irish universities 2 new product design programs in medical devices and in generic mechanical engineering design at Trinity College Dublin and NUI Galway, working in cooperation with Stanford Engineering School. So it's very possible with relatively small amounts of funding and resources to establish your own product design programs here in Europe. A few comments about Silicon Valley in Europe. What I'm going to show now are just some of the slides I presented 2 weeks to my students at Stanford in terms of what's the strategic landscape between US and Europe, between Silicon Valley and Europe today. Of course, the US and EU have been holding trade negotiation talks for the past many months in Brussels and Washington, D.C. Those are ongoing. Of course, there's the bigger issue, very big issue of surveillance by the U.S. government of European leaders and European countries and consumers and American consumers. Along with calls by Angela Merkel that Europe should set up its own cloud computing network and other computing networks, which would, to be honest, is probably not going to help or be to the benefit of many of our Silicon Valley companies. But we didn't want this. We didn't expect this. This is what Washington, D.C. did. This is the price Silicon Valley pays for neglecting Washington, D.C. and basically not having strong ties into certain parts of the U.S. government. So this is something that I think will continue to develop and could provide the foundation for a new strong IT industry in Europe, which I think is good for Europe. Of course, we just went over that. Neelie Kroes, based in Brussels, very strong European commissioner, very focused on ICT data privacy, very impressive. We've also been following at Stanford the events in Crimea and in Maidan, going back to early January. We're very disturbed about this. We're very worried. Part of what I wanted to emphasize to my students in Silicon Valley is that their rights to build companies, their rights to create disruptive ideas that can create thousands of job losses in other parts of the world, the ability to create very new approaches is based fundamentally on the freedom of speech, freedom of association, on trust, freedom from fear, freedom from intimidation. And all of this has been challenged with what's happened in Crimea in recent weeks. Independently of this, back in early February, Stanford University put on hold our Moscow program for reasons not related to Crimea, but for other reasons which have a lot to do with doing business in Russia on a regular basis anyway. So we'll see whether Stanford continues to maintain its Moscow program. The point here that I wanted to give to my students is that a strong, growing, peaceful Europe is very important for prosperity and future growth of Silicon Valley. So finally, just wrapping up, the point of design thinking is a way to bring together technology, business, and people together, bringing functional innovation, experience innovation, process innovation, emotional innovation into new products and services that can solve major human needs and wants, and that can make a big change in our quality of life around the world. So again, I bring back to you the notion that design really deserves and should be an integral part of what universities teach and do research on, not just science, not just Wissenschaft, but design actually is a very fundamental human activity which needs to be researched and understood in the same way that science does. And design can also contribute to science and doing good science. And finally, keep in mind that this is often what success is about. This is what it takes to explore new ideas, to do something great. And beware of the straight linear path. It may be far less boring and interesting for you. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions. Who has the mic? Archers has the mic. Yes. In the way back.
Thank you. I'm Mats Kapelin.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
I'm Mats Kapelin, from Techniskā University. My question is, what is the key difference between classical Humboldt University, Forschungslehrerlehre, and your Stanford University? What are the key differences?
What are the key differences between the Stanford model and classical university model?
Classical university, Humboldt University, Forschungslehre is the keys, and maybe some innovation.
Sure. So the two key differences is that Stanford professors, and again primarily in the engineering school, it started with engineering school, believe that the traditional model of strong separation between university and industry was just not very interesting, and that industry actually can present some very interesting research problems and challenges for universities, and that industry can be a good partner for universities. So our Dean of Engineering back in the 1950s, actually it was 1930s, he encouraged two of his students, Hewlett and Packard, to go off and form the first great company out of Stanford. So that's one difference, is we do not view industry as the enemy, as the corrupter. We view industry as an ally, as a partner. We put in place very clear conflict of interest rules, which make sure that our collaborations with industry do not corrupt our academic mission. But we work very closely with industry, and this is at all levels of the university. And so there's a strong bond of trust between Stanford and the technology companies we work with in the Valley and around the world. Now, technology companies who come from Europe and Asia, we have to explain to them how we work because it's often different from how they work with local universities, but they get it. This is why Daimler and many other European companies work at Stanford. So that's one difference. Second difference is that Stanford believes that in addition to the traditional mission of a university, which is science, teaching, and research, that economic development is also part of the mission of the university. And so if you believe that, that means that commercialization becomes part of your mission. That means that spin-outs become part of your mission. That means working with companies and creating jobs, helping to create jobs and getting intellectual property out the door into commercial use as quickly as possible is also part of the mission of the university. And so our professors are judged on traditional criteria, so numbers of publications, funding, just like your professors are here. But in addition, they're judged on these criteria such as have you spun out a company? How is your research being used commercially anywhere? if it's being used in research, if it's being used in commercial applications, that's a huge sign from the world that your research, your intellectual property is good enough that it's being used by thousands and millions of people around the world. That's a very strong indicator of impact and returns to society and human good. So those are, I think, the two main differences between the classical university and Stanford. Also, we experiment a lot. We try out new ideas very quickly. Just last year, we established a new office, a vice provost office for online education, entirely with internal funds to explore MOOCs and this whole online education. Now we're exploring many different models for how to deliver teaching and content online to students both at Stanford and outside Stanford. Yes, question over here.
Hello, I'm Martin Gredic from Rīgas Technical University, and you said that there are 500 companies started every year in Stanford, and how many of them survive more than 3 years, for example?
Most of them fail. I don't have exact numbers for you. That's okay.
But what's the percentage of the good and bad companies?
So let me, I won't flip all the way back, but of those 500 companies a year, I told you about the StartX, the Stanford incubator, only 10% are accepted to the incubator. So the other 90%, we don't know exactly what happens to them, but many of them probably fail. So let's say 70, 80% of those fail. That's okay.
Thank you.
Yes?
Hello. I have two questions. One of them is personal, my question, and the other is according to this lecture. So first, in Stanford University, how many different faculties do you have? I mean, and my personal question, just it's interesting for me why your name contains something like Lee. It's very interesting for me. Thank you.
Sure. So, I used to live in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, where there's a sizable population of Chinese Jamaicans who immigrated there. And whenever I would go to meet someone new who I hadn't met, they were always surprised that it wasn't an Oriental or Chinese guy who showed up. Lee, as it turns out, is also an English name. And so perhaps the most famous Lee in the United States, who's not Chinese, is Robert E. Lee, who was a famous general during the American Civil War in the 1860s. But my family name Lee originally comes from Great Britain, from England. In terms of numbers of faculties, so we have schools. So schools correspond approximately to faculties here. We have 7 schools, and under each school we have several departments. So, and then over each school is a dean. So basically supervises loosely all the different departments in his or her area. In engineering, I think we have 8 departments. So civil, electrical, computer science, mechanical, management science and engineering, aeronautical, and chemical engineering. So that would be 8, actually. And then in humanities, there are, I think, probably maybe 10 departments. And so it's a slightly different organizational structure. Professors do not have as much power in American universities as they have in European universities. We have stronger deans, whereas here the deans don't have as much authority and ability to manage the faculties. Yes. Hello, good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you again as well. And it was a pleasure to listen to your lecture. And I have really more technical question. You actually build on the ones we had before. You mentioned that professors, if they are involved in entrepreneurship, then they could gain some additional benefit in terms of credit or for during their, let's say, oration. What about students? Do they have any incentive for them really to be so active in building their companies? Do they get any credit points? Do they have any additional bonus in, let's say, starting up their companies? And the second question is about, do you have any figures on the increase in GDP, let's say, in your area or in the US, based on the outcome from the university?
So as an overall number, let me answer the second question first. As an overall number, I'm not aware of any total number. There have been some in-depth studies done of MIT and Stanford, so the economic value created was actually by the same researcher. And what he did extensive survey historical assessment, and his assessment was that over 30 to 40 years, across all the companies that have been created out of MIT, the total economic value out of MIT was $2 trillion, and the total economic value out of Stanford was $3 trillion. So you can see universities, if they're organized properly, if they have the right culture, I mean, it takes many things to put these in place, but universities really have the potential to be the main economic engines of an entire country and region. So this is why it's so important that you're focused on getting the universities right and doing adjustments to the university model wherever possible, particularly around working with industry, incentivizing students, I'll get to that in a minute, and spinning up companies and basically accelerating the transfer of intellectual property out of the laboratories and out of the classrooms into real commercial uses. So on the second point, students can take courses. There are many courses on entrepreneurship. Students get credit for them. They count them towards their degrees. There's no real other specific benefit in terms of formal incentives. It's a very informal cultural incentive in the sense that the idea of creating your own company, of taking your dream, your idea into reality, of getting a team of people to work with you, of raising investment, it's very challenging. But the idea of doing this and being your own boss, being in charge, working with other people, that's very attractive to students who are seeing in the U.S. increasing insecurity from working with established companies. I mean, there are some very good companies out there, but the best students in the engineering school typically want to go start their own companies. It used to be that Hewlett-Packard used to be the top company in Silicon Valley to work for. Well, no one really wants to work for Hewlett-Packard today because they're considered to be a declining firm. Yahoo, no one's quite sure what's happening with Yahoo. Students will go, so being offered a job at Google is very attractive. Google is one of the large corporations that actually provides a very attractive working environment. But at many American companies, the idea of going into a regimented 9-by-5 job, working for a boss you don't like, it's very hierarchical, very rigid. It just doesn't seem that much fun any longer. And if you can build your own company, it's more fun, you're much more in control. You might make a lot of money out of it. If you don't, if you fail, you've still learned a lot. Even if you fail, you can still get a job at Google. In fact, you might be more likely to get a job at Google or Facebook if you fail, because you've actually tried to do a company and you understand a lot more of what it takes to build a real product. So those are some of the soft incentives which the ecosystem creates rather than formal incentives that the university creates. There's no formal requirements to graduate, for example, or anything like that. You tend to meet a much more interesting group of people with lots of new ideas flowing around. It's very, very exciting and challenging to be working in entrepreneurship at Stanford today as an undergraduate, master's, or PhD student. Yes, question over here.
I'm Oscar Kormans from RTU. And my question is, you referred previously to creating a company in 10 weeks. Would you suggest such class for, even for such basic educational and engineering programs in Riga Technical University as a class, mandatory for all students?
I would definitely recommend such a class here at Riga Technical University. I'm not sure I would make it mandatory for all students. Maybe, I would have to think about that. But I think it would be very valuable for students here to have to go out and talk to users, to real people, to get out of the classroom and to begin to understand what it takes to find out how to make something that other people want to buy. It really takes you out of your safety space and it puts you into the real world. And it's a great skill you can learn in any other type of job you do. So this is the type of education, we will be seeing this spreading across Europe probably in the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to take a while before it really jumps to the US. It's being taught, I think, in Finland and a few other places now. So go to Helsinki, to Aalto University. I think you can see this lean launchpad approach being used right now. But I think part of, so coming back to your original question, we think there's equal value in experiential education, getting students out into the real world, equal value to that as lecture education, where students are writing notes and writing down equations and listening passively to professors. We think experiential education in the real world is just as valuable and just as important as the theoretical side. One question back here.